Oh, thanks for coming and joining us today, Brendan. I am very excited. I think this is a super important issue that's not getting enough coverage, and I'm eager to learn even more than I already know certain things, but feel like I am well behind what we need to do in order to fix some of these things. So, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, that'd be awesome.
Sure. And I should apologize in advance. I'll have to leave at like the 45 or 50-minute mark just because I've got some other
That should be plenty of time.
work stuff that I got to cover, but it's great to meet all of you. So my name is Brendan Ballou. I was at the Department of Justice for about 6 years, for several of them as the special counsel for private equity in the antitrust division, although sort of most recently, the work that I was doing was actually on the January 6th prosecution. So an entirely different thing that I'm happy to talk about if it's helpful. But the reason that I am with you all today is to talk about private equity. And I'm happy to talk for, 10, 15 minutes and kind of give the basics of the industry and sort of why we often have bad consequences with private equity. But then perhaps we can have this more as a discussion. I'd like to hear from you all about your experiences with PE and your thoughts about, what kind of problems we're seeing, what kind of solutions we can have. So just to set a baseline here as to what private equity is, because I think it's an expression that most of us have heard of, but maybe don't necessarily know what it does. And I confess that was the case for me when I was starting out on this project. I was researching it before I even knew what private equity firms were. I really kind of stumbled onto it because I was looking at all these acquisitions that were getting reported in the news by companies that I'd never heard of, Blackstone and Carlyle and KKR and so forth. And so I started looking into what they actually are. And what I found is that the basic business model of private equity firms is really simple, which is that they take a little bit of their own money, some borrowed money, and then some investor money, and then a lot of borrowed money to buy up companies, which they then try to make financial or operational changes to the business with the goal of selling them for a profit a few years later. Um, this is all, at some level, a very simple idea, the idea of trying to flip something to make a quick hit of money. But what makes private equity special is that when they borrow the money to buy up the company, it's not the private equity firm that's typically responsible for paying back the debt. It's actually the company they buy that's responsible. So if you're buying Ben and Jerry's as a private equity firm or Shopko or Payless Shoes or whatever it happens to be, and it costs $1 billion or whatever, the $1 billion that you spend is going to be a borrowed money that you don't have to pay back. It's Ben and Jerry's or Shopko or Payless that's going to have to pay back, which is a little bit like getting to use somebody else's credit card, which is kind of this incredible magic trick. So that's one of the core problems with the private equity business model is, you're really getting to use somebody else's money. But there are a couple other basic problems with private equity. One of which was sort of implicit in what I was just saying, which is that private equity firms tend to hold the companies they buy for just a few years, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, maybe. And how long you invest in something changes how seriously you take it or how you think about the company. I always joke if, I was going to own my apartment for 20 years, I'd redo the kitchen. If I was going to own it for 2 weeks, I'd burn it down and try to get the insurance money. It changes your perspective. And so when a private equity firm owns a business for just 2 years, they're probably not going to invest in infrastructure or R&D in their employees or in their brand. They're probably just going to focus on cost cutting because that's the quickest way to make money, even if it hurts the business in the long term. So part of it is short-termism. Part of it is loading these companies up with a lot of debt. And at the same time that they're loading companies up with debt, they're extracting a lot of fees, transaction fees whenever a company does a big deal, or management fees for the privilege of being owned by the private equity firm. And even though the private equity firm captures only a portion of the profits of a company, it gets all of the fees. And so there's an incentive to extract as much money as they can from the business, even if it hurts the long-term profitability of that business. So first problem, short-term perspective. Second problem, debt and fees. And then the third problem, and I think in some ways this is the most important, although it's the one that's the least covered, is that private equity firms are really good at insulating themselves from the legal and financial consequences of their actions, which means that if even if they control a business, if somebody gets hurt, somebody dies, somebody gets discriminated against, and they want to sue, they can probably sue the business, but they can't sue the private equity firm. And so when you combine all those things together, it means that private equity firms tend to capture the upside when something goes well, but can walk away when something goes badly. And the example that I use at the beginning of the book is Carlisle buying up this nursing home chain called HCR Manor Care. And at the time, Manor Care was the second largest nursing home chain in the United States. Carlisle bought it up. It then slashed staffing, which you could imagine if they're trying to make a quick hit of cash, that's a quick way to reduce costs. They executed what's called a sale leaseback, where they required Manor Care to sell all of its real estate and then rent it back to itself, which is, again, a way to generate a quick hit of cash. But now Manor Care is paying every month a lease for something that it used to own. And then while they're collecting all these fees from these sales and these transactions, and they're slashing staffing, health code violations or complaints spike, and eventually at least one resident at one of these facilities dies because of alleged understaffing. This woman had to go to the bathroom by herself. There wasn't somebody to help her. She fell, hit her head on a bathroom fixture. She eventually dies of subdural hematoma. But when her family sues for wrongful death, Carlisle was able to get the case against it dismissed by saying it wasn't the technical owner of the nursing home chain. Rather, it was just an advisor to a series of funds who, through several shell companies, ultimately owned the nursing home chain. Carlisle was able to get the case against it dismissed. And what I think that illustrates is how private equity firms, and Carlisle made more than his money back on Manor Care, even though Manor Care eventually went bankrupt. What I think it illustrates is that private equity firms can often succeed even when the businesses they buy and the consumers they serve, the employees they hire, when they fail. So it's a real mismatch. And that's unfortunate because private equity is just an enormous part of our economy now. These statistics are a few years old, so I'd have to look them up again. But by one count, Carlyle, KKR, and Blackstone, depending on the order, would be the third, fourth, and fifth largest employers in the United States if you included them with their portfolio companies, behind just Amazon and Walmart. So these are enormous businesses, but people generally don't really know about them because Blackstone doesn't, brand the emergency rooms that it owns as a Blackstone emergency room. KKR doesn't brand the veterinary clinics that it maybe owns as, a KKR branded veterinary clinic. And so the chances are good that you're interacting with a private equity firm multiple times a day, but you don't even notice it. Aside from, sort of the consequences of that ownership, the fact that, private equity owned businesses are 10 times as likely to go bankrupt as businesses that aren't private equity owned. The fact that in retail businesses, private equity and PE and hedge fund ownership resulted in an estimated 600,000 job losses in a 10-year period at a time when the industry as a whole added a million jobs. The fact that by one estimate, private equity ownership is responsible for 20,000 premature deaths in nursing homes because of that ownership. So even if you don't see a private equity firm, your life is almost certainly being shaped by private equity. And private equity is expanding into all sorts of businesses that really matter. From the veterinarians who take care of your animals to the OBGYNs or oncologists that treat you to emergency rooms and so forth, to the very infrastructure that we use. Some cities have sold their water services to private equity owned businesses. So, it's a problem. It's a big problem, but I don't want to monologue too much. So I want to talk very briefly about solutions here, and then hopefully we can have this be a conversation. You know, I think that there is a lot that can be done to control private equity to make it a more responsible part of our economy. The basic idea should be that private equity firms should be responsible for their own actions in their businesses. If Carlisle could have been legally responsible for the death of that nursing home resident, Carlisle probably would have behaved a lot more responsibly, probably been less likely to slash staffing at that nursing home. So, we really just need to align control with responsibility with private equity firms. That's not going to happen at the federal level right now. The private equity industry is incredibly powerful across both parties. Private equity executives have enormous influence in this administration. Steven Schwartzman, who founded Blackstone, is sort of an unpaid envoy for Donald Trump in his negotiations with Harvard. Mark Rowan, who currently runs Apollo, is doing something similar in negotiations with Penn and other schools. And then, various private equity executives have been placed in the government. The number two official at the Department of Defense is a private equity executive. I think at the federal level, there's not much that's going to happen. But at the state level, I really do think that progress is possible. And I think we can amend some of our state corporation laws to ensure that private equity firms are responsible for their actions when they actually have control of their businesses. And if that happens, then, like I said, private equity is going to become a much more responsible part of our economy. The last thing that I'll just say to finish up this monologue is I often hear some people say, and I don't think that that's what this crowd would say, but what I often hear more skeptical people say about private equity is they say, well, private equity is just a form of capitalism. It's an extreme form of capitalism. People that are really focused on making profits. Do we really want to interfere with that? And what I try to say is that private equity isn't an extreme form of capitalism, but rather a perversion of capitalism, or at least a perversion of capitalism in the positive sense. Because it's not that they are, just seeking quick profits. It's that they can capture profits but walk away from losses. It's really not a form of capitalism, but an invention by lawyers like me. And I always sort of joke that every 20 years or so, private equity firms manage to invent a bad business model. Or sorry, lawyers invent a bad business model. Like right now it's private equity, but 20 years ago it was subprime lenders, 40 years ago it was S&Ls, 60 years ago it was conglomerates, 100 years ago it was trusts. You could just go back every couple decades. And so a lot of what we need is just citizens and activists to push back and to sort of break the model that we lawyers have created. Which is why I'm excited to talk to all of you. I hope that this is sort of an ongoing conversation. At some point, we want to put out model legislation for how we can make private equity firms responsible. And I think it's going to be groups like yours that actually make that legislation real. I've been monologuing for a while. I'd love to get your guys' questions, but more than anything, I'd like to get your thoughts. So, your stories, your reactions, and hopefully this can be a dialogue.
Well, thank you for your work, and I'm excited about this because I've felt it was a big problem for years, and I thought we were making progress under the last administration. Then, of course, it got reversed. One thing you didn't talk about, and then I'll open it up to other questions, was the housing market. It seems to me that a lot of the firms you named own a big portion of the U.S. housing market now. And how is that different from some of the models that you described about veterinary care and hospitals and nursing
Yeah.
homes?
It's a great
Or is,
question.
yeah,
Yeah. So private equity firms really have been working to transform the nature of housing in America. And I should be sort of specific in that it's not just private equity firms. I think the finance industry in general has been responsible here. But part of the reason why you don't hear about Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan transforming the housing industry so much is they all became much more regulated after the Great Recession in 2008. And so a lot of all of the innovation, and I don't necessarily mean that as a compliment, in the finance industry went to private equity firms, which are far less regulated.
mm,
And so after 2008, private equity firms really got into the business of buying up homes. In particular, buying off tracts of homes that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were selling off, buying them dozens or hundreds at a time. There was this amazing statistic that before the recession, there wasn't a single company in the world that owned more than 1,000 homes in America.
oh wow,
And Blackstone bought 1,000 homes in a single day,
yeah,
at the peak of its acquisitions. And, a lot of what they're doing is flipping those homes into single family rentals. So a lot of people that used to own their homes now rent them with the profits going to private equity firms. I think that plays a huge role in restricting housing supply and raising costs. You hear in city after city that people are bidding not against other residents, but against other investors. And I think that's working out fabulously for private equity firms and for financiers, but it's making it hard for folks that, normally home ownership is the primary way by which Americans generate wealth. And because of private equity firms' involvement here, I saw one commentator, I haven't been able to independently verify this, that home ownership rates, one, they've declined dramatically from sort of the peak in the 2000s, but among, for instance, African Americans, home ownership is down back to what it was, at least according to one analysis, down to where it was during the civil rights era.
Wow.
So there's uh, there's a lot of transformation happening. One last point on this is
Sure.
I think it's not just that private equity firms have been buying up homes and apartment buildings. It's that it's accompanied by vastly greater political influence. So you saw that in California, I think about 10 years ago, when Blackstone was heavily involved in lobbying to prevent a ballot initiative that would allow extend tenant protections from multifamily homes, so apartment buildings, to single family rentals. And collectively, I think their organization spent something like $72 million opposing that, and were successful in beating back that ballot initiative. All of which is to say that I think it's not just that private equity firms have money, it's that they also have enormous political influence. And I think that's in large part what's made them so successful in housing.
Yeah, there was a bill in the California Senate last year to limit them to 1,000 units, single
Mm,
family homes per LLC, and that bill failed. And
wow.
and 1,000 is a very high amount, in my opinion. Andy, good to see you. You got a question?
You and thanks for hosting this today, David. Um, I was going to ask about housing too. I like to break things. So if I can help move along a model legislation, I'm happy to do so because that's what I do. Um, but I think my question is, how how do they hedge investments in residential homes, and how does that operate? Because it seems to me that the homelessness problem is really tied up in this whole conversation, and I appreciate your work, Brendan.
Yeah, can you unpack that a little bit more? I just want to make sure that I'm being responsive. When you say hedge, what do you mean by that?
I think I know what you mean if you need help, Andy.
Go for it.
In the way that you described
David is my brain. Go.
in the way that you described how they extract money from these other places by renting them out, lowering staff, that and they're getting their fees. It seems like the housing model is a different model where they've got to keep money in. And I
I
think that's
see.
what you're asking, right? Andy is like,
Yep, yep.
yeah,
Okay, yeah, got it. No, that's a really great question, and there are other folks that really focus on housing who can give you a better answer than I can. But I think what I've seen oftentimes is a couple things. One is that when private equity firms get into the rental market, so either single family rentals or multi units, a lot of what they figure out is that they're going to in effect jack up rents through various secret fees. So you start seeing the lawn maintenance fee, the pet ownership fee, the smart lock fee, and so forth. And I think they realize that you can once you've got somebody in a house, you can start adding on those fees, and it's going to take a lot before they're actually going to leave. At the same time, I think that they have been much more aggressive at kicking out tenants that aren't able to make rent on a given month and to try to flip them faster than a mom and pop shop might. I'm not actually sure that that's necessarily the smart move for anybody involved. If somebody's going to be 5 days late on the rent, because they need to get their paycheck or something like that, it's kind of in everybody's interest to just give them the 5 days because you don't have for the resident you get to keep your home. For the company, you don't have to go through the process of finding a new tenant. But because these are such mammoth firms, they don't really have that kind of flexibility built into them. And so you see stories of really aggressive efforts to push people out of their homes, doing things that are frankly embarrassing, like putting police caution tape outside of people's homes and apartments and so forth to try to shame them
right.
into paying rent and so forth. I think the other thing is one of the things that I've been really interested in is because there's been a lot of coverage of private equity ownership of the homes themselves, less so of private equity ownership of the surrounding infrastructure of rental or home ownership. So, for instance, one thing that they've gotten into is financing for home ownership and for home flipping. So, they're not just buying up homes themselves, they are providing the loans. So the small grade, HGTV people can also buy up homes and flip them. On the exact other side of that, one area that at least Fortress Investments got really into was mortgage servicing. So buying up small companies that handle the mortgage servicing industry, combining them and trying to create this sort of mortgage conglomerate. The problem is they did it way too fast, and without any real care for, how well they're doing it. And so they started doing things like missing payments, not paying property taxes, accidentally foreclosing on people's homes. And there were heartbreaking stories in the New York Times of, residents actually having paid their mortgages, being up to date on it, and having their homes foreclosed and then sold, and they weren't able to get it back based on errors. Um, so, I think one of the things that I would love to learn more about, frankly, is private equity in home ownership, in the parts of home ownership that we don't necessarily see all the time.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Lauren, hi.
Hi, how are you doing today?
Good. And I'm happy to answer questions, but I'd love to hear your guys' sort of reactions or sort of your guys' experience with private equity too, your thoughts in general.
Yeah, so I apologize. I had to join a few minutes late. My last meeting ran a bit long. So I just want to make sure I'm summarizing correctly. Your point is that, what we do about private equity is we better regulate it to make them accountable for the harms that they cause.
Yeah.
But I guess I I struggle to see how that addresses the core problem of like private equity's purpose is to extract value, right? Like they're an extractive entity. And so how is that helping communities where they're buying up all the houses, they're extracting all the value of the houses? We can regulate it so that each LLC only owns 1,000 houses. Okay, then they're going to create more LLCs. Like I think I fail to see how increased regulation would deal with the extractive nature of private equity. So I wonder if you could walk me through that a bit.
Yeah. And that's a critique that I hear, and I think it's a fair critique, which is, is there something sort of at core kind of rotten about private equity that, you just kind of need to ban the industry altogether? I think there are a couple responses. One is that there's no legal definition for private equity. It's not like somebody goes to the SEC and registers as a private equity firm, weirdly enough. Um, it's really private equity is just an extension of any sort of private investment, by which I mean people giving money to a company or to a person to invest in a business outside of going to the stock market. Um, and one of the reasons that I tend to try to focus on fairly narrow or targeted solutions here is I think that sometimes the broader critique of the entire finance industry, and I'm not trying to impute that to what you're saying here, but it's a version that I've heard, while entirely understandable, is kind of paralyzing in its own way, which is if we say the problem is American finance entirely and we need to start from scratch, I think that can be such an overwhelming problem that it's sort of more depressing than saying we have this specific problem with private equity and here's how we solve it. I'll also say just in a more positive way, and I say this as somebody that maxed out for Bernie, like I consider myself fairly progressive. Um, I think that there's always a role for private money to play in our economy. I don't want every company to have to go to the stock market to try to raise money. And so there's always going to be a role for somebody to put up money so that a company can buy, build a factory, hire new people, invest in a new product and so forth. I think that's a good thing. The challenge is when you create, and again, lawyers do it, create a fundamental mismatch between control and responsibility. And that I think at core is like the basic rot of private equity. And I think that's a solvable problem. So I am very sympathetic to your point that it's like as long as people are extracting value from businesses, it's a problem. But I also think that a sort of an overbroad critique is actually sort of counterproductive. And I'm not saying that that's your critique, but it's a version that I'm heard. I'm curious for your reaction. Feel free to disagree with me on all of this.
Yeah, I think I agree. You can't just say the entire financial system is bad. I don't think that's what I'm trying to say. But I
Yeah,
do
no, no,
think,
and I didn't mean to like impute that to you. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, no, I appreciate that. But I do think that there is a really big difference between like a local credit union lending out
Yeah,
a small business loan versus like private equity buying up entire housing markets
yeah.
and like forcing foreclosures. So I guess I'm just wondering, like, yeah, I do think that there's a differentiation there. And then like, what do you, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, well, and that maybe is like kind of like another axis of a problem in private equity that I haven't focused on too much, but I think is like a worthy one, which is like the probably the difference between the private credit union and Blackstone is Blackstone has $1 trillion, in assets under management, and the concentration of our finance industry is kind of a new phenomenon. We didn't really have nationally chartered banks until the 1990s. We didn't have sort of the private equity version that we currently have it, where they're involved in all sorts of different kinds of industries until the Great Recession. So, like, what we're seeing in the finance industry and the scale that we're seeing it is kind of unprecedented. Or maybe the precedent is really like the trusts of the 1900s. And I think that scale really does create a more extractive perspective. Like the credit union is trying to make money too, but the difference is like it's based in the community and has some desire to have the community succeed. And chances are the person that runs the credit union probably lives in the community too. None of those things are necessarily true with Blackstone. Steven Schwartzman has houses in Florida and New York and a whole bunch of other places. The executives at Apollo and KKR too. All the money that they're making are flowing to their fellow executives in a handful of very wealthy cities. And they're leaving smaller communities. And so I think you can have a world where you have private investment, but maybe to get to your critique a little bit more is like you need these institutions to be vastly smaller and vastly more local than they currently are. Does that seem closer to right to you?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
what would be helpful for me, Brendan, too, is to understand the types of legislation or where we could find models of legislation that we could pass at, perhaps even at the local level, if not the state level,
Yeah.
and bringing those to our legislators to say, here's because part of what I'm understanding you saying is that it took a lawyer to create it because it's complex. And so, in order to unwind it or limit it, you also need someone who understands the complexities well enough to use the right language to
Yeah.
keep it in its place. So, any thoughts on where we might get some of
Yeah.
that language?
So I'm more than happy for this to be like, I'd love for this to be an ongoing
Yeah,
conversation, and if I can be helpful with you guys in proposing legislation in LA or elsewhere, absolutely happy to engage and try to help with some of the drafting stuff, time permitting. There are a couple organizations that are out there that have tried variations on this. One is called the American Economic Liberties Project,
sure.
based here in DC, and then the other is Americans for Financial Reform. The first one AELP, for instance, did some interesting like model legislation around veterinary clinics. The idea being like we want to stop acquisitions of veterinary clinics by PE firms, and I think that's great. One of the challenges that are one of the concerns that I have about that strategy is, you know, a little bit to Lauren's point, if you do it industry by industry, you're going to play whack-a-mole given the size of these businesses. And what would be better is if you had general sort of cross-industry legislation in cities and states. So to give you an example, so one of which is the sort of corporate control thing that I've been harping on, is probably needs to happen at the state level saying, look, if you're a private equity firm that has operational control of the business, you are responsible for the outcome of that business. That's like principle one. Principle two, to the extent that you guys are thinking about housing, for instance, one thing that we could do is really just have sort of local antitrust laws similar to what we have at the national level that, like the FTC and Lena Khan and DOJ try to enforce. And basically, you can make them a lot simpler and a lot more effective than the federal antitrust laws, and just say something to the effect of, look, you can't you can build a business as big as you want it to be. And if you are a really successful business and everybody loves you, that's great. And you capture all the market share, that's wonderful. But you can't buy your way into being a monopoly. In fact, you can't buy your way into controlling, let's say, more than a quarter of the market. And if you control more than, if you try to buy more than a quarter of the market, the city of LA is going to stop you, or the state of California is going to stop you. And I think that kind of legislation would be enormously helpful. And it would solve the problems in the veterinary industry, but also solve the problems in the housing industry and the dental industry and all the other areas where private equity is active. And you only need to pass the bill once rather than having to pass that bill 10,000 times,
Mm.
for each industry.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. Linda, you've been so patient. What's your question?
I'm just curious, are these firms the ones that are buying up the hospitals and then dismantling them? Now, here's part two of my question. Isn't there some sort of laws in the states that prevent people from doing this because it endangers the health and welfare and can even kill people by doing that? Are there not laws that can be enforced? Um,
Yeah.
I'm a senior citizen, and so I'm quite concerned. I mean, I live in a fairly decent city, though. I'm not concerned it's going to happen here, but I have friends that live in rural areas that have got to travel miles and miles to hospitals. So I'm sure part two of my question is, does this happen in other countries? Do
Mm,
private equity firms happen in other countries, or are they better at regulating them than we are?
That's a
Great
great
question.
question.
So on the second part, on the second question, I don't know the answer as well because as an American lawyer, I really focus overwhelmingly just on American stuff. But in my conversations with folks, PE is definitely like a global industry, and super active in Europe, super active in China. I have not heard sort of the same scale of problems in terms of them buying up companies and it turning into absolute disasters. And I think part of that is just the sort of political power that private equity firms have in the United States and the way that they've been able to shape laws. I just don't think they have quite the same level of influence in the UK, for instance. On the first part on hospitals, yeah, absolutely. So, the story that you probably heard about, Stewart Hospital on the East Coast, was dismantled. That was a hospital chain that was created. They bought up a bunch of old hospitals created by the private equity firm Cerberus. And then they did all these tactics that we were talking about earlier, like a sale leaseback, where they sold all of the underlying assets and then they used that to pay themselves a dividend. They slashed staffing. It became like really insane to such an extent that I think at one of the hospitals, like a mouse got trapped in one of the generators and like power just went out in one of the hospitals for something like 18 hours. They had so few supplies that when COVID first broke out, they didn't have sort of dedicated COVID wards. They just had a sheet that they put up between the COVID patients and the non-COVID patients. Well, anyways, the guy that ran Cerberus is now the number two official of the Department of Defense. So,
That sucks.
yeah, it
Oh,
does.
sorry.
No, you're right. No, I was working with Warren's people to try to get that stopped. In fact, sorry, this is like an aside. It's crazy that he got confirmed because he also created a company called Tier One that I don't know if they intended this, but they actually trained the Saudi paramilitary guys that killed Jamal Khashoggi. So it kind of astounds me that the guy that created the company that trained the guys that killed Khashoggi is now helping to run our military, but it is what it is.
Mm.
On the steward stuff, I I keep saying like it's not really something that I'm the real expert on, but like I have talked to a lot of folks in Massachusetts that like understandably were completely outraged about this, and I know their state legislature was moving to pass legislation on this. I think their state AG was moving to investigate. A lot of it is um, helping lawyers just understand how private equity firms are structured in order to sue the right people and to ask the right questions. And so part of this is an education thing, but part of it too, like we've been saying, like on some of this stuff, there really aren't the laws that there need to be to hold these firms accountable. So that's why we're going to need some legislative action, if not at the federal level, then at the state and local one.
Thank you.
Sangam, did you have a question or?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Brendan, for what you've presented. This is like a completely new topic to me, and honestly, I probably don't understand a lot of what you said, but I do understand it enough, I think, at the heart level. And so, like I really liked the term of like short-termism. I think that is just how so much of like globally, that's how so many people are. Um, like operating. And so, but there's one thing that you said, which was like, um, you said capitalism and like how this is not a part of capitalism. And I think this kind of goes to Lauren's point a little bit and of like zooming out a bit,
Yeah.
and getting out of the weeds and the details of it. But like, it, capitalism is um, about extraction, right? It's about getting a little bit more out of something and not reciprocating its actual worth. And
Hmm.
so, like, my question, I guess, is like, how is this not a part of capitalism? Like, how does it not fit that umbrella term?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I mean, you can view capitalism through different lenses, and you can see capitalism as a fundamentally predatory institution that needs to be scrapped and start over. And I think that's a valid critique. I also think that there's a more hopeful version of capitalism, as opposed to state ownership of production, where capitalism in the sort of best Louis Brandeis sense of the word is, people starting their own businesses, they succeed. If they succeed, they make money. If they fail, they lose their money. But a fundamentally fair competition. I would say private equity is a perversion of sort of the idealized best form of capitalism. But you could also, if you sort of see capitalism through the lens of as essentially being fundamentally broken, you can see private equity through that lens as well. Part of the reason that I choose such sort of normie language on some of this stuff, and like I try not to make this a critique of capitalism generally, is the same thing that I was talking about earlier, which is I think it can be paralyzing for folks. And one of the things that I even try to do is I try to say I'm not even critiquing the American finance system overall. You can come up with your own critiques of Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan, and Lord knows there are things to critique about them because they started a housing crisis. But by trying to say we have this one part of the finance industry that's causing these very specific problems, and we actually can solve that, I think that that's more empowering for people than trying to sort of than me sort of saying this is a broad problem with American finance or this is a broad problem with American capitalism. So maybe that's a tactical choice on my part, and maybe that's a mistake, but I'd be curious for what your thoughts are.
So I,
Could I
Sangam, do you
speak to
want
that?
Dorothy, if you hold on, we've only got a few more minutes with Brendan. So I just want to let Sangam respond. And then I have one last question for Brendan before he
Um,
has to take off.
yeah, I just have to sit with that information. I don't have a response, but thank you for diving into it.
No, no, I think it's a really good critique. So like like I said, I really do hope that this is kind of an ongoing conversation. Yeah.
So, Brendan, I want to give you a chance to share anything else you want to share about your upcoming work or your book before you go. But my last question for you is it sounds from what I'm hearing from you that solving this legislatively at the national level is going to be challenging, especially we know it's going to be challenging during this administration. But it also sounds like there's not enough public understanding of the issue to push on legislators to get them to override any funds that they're getting from very wealthy donors. And so, A, do you see that as the problem? And B, what can we do to collectively to change that?
Yeah, and maybe if I don't want to sort of control the narrative, but if Dorothy and Andy want to sort of add their comments or questions, I can just kind of do everything in
Sounds
sequence
good.
here. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Dorothy.
I agree that the best way to approach the legislation is how you've described it, Brandon. But I also think that in the larger scheme of things, what America needs is a description of and a vision for the new economy, which would regulate all of the distortions of capitalism so that we can have a well-being economy, which is why I'm coming to these calls, and that our elected officials are missing that point. And when they say economy, they only mean prices. We have to change the narrative. And this is very good information about the private equity area, which I didn't know about. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thanks,
Andy,
Dorothy.
what were you going to say?
Dorothy, that was very, very well said. Very clearly said. Uh, uh, I think we need a new Teddy Roosevelt to fix the whole system, like Dorothy mentioned. Um, but you asked for examples. We lived in an apartment in West LA. They got bought up by a private equity firm and turned into a sober living facility. And literally, our child, who was born 3 months early, and they made us move out right after that, and it was infuriating. Um, and then they started charging $10,000 a bed a night. So our little three bedroom apartment was suddenly making them, um, like 60,000, $70,000 a night. So that's just my little. You asked for some stories. There's mine.
That's amazing. That's incredible. And I don't have a lot of confidence in a private equity firm running a sober living facility or doing that particularly well. I know that they've gotten into drug treatment facilities. I know that they've gotten into um, special education, autism services, early childhood education stuff. And yet again, this is the basic problem, which is if they're trying to make a quick hit of cash and aren't responsible for the downside, they're going to cut costs. And bad things are going to happen, but they aren't necessarily going to be responsible. To Dorothy's point about a well-being economy, yeah, absolutely. I think there needs to be a broader conception of sort of what corporations are for. This idea that the sole purpose of a corporation is to create to create value for shareholders or maximize profit for shareholders is a kind of recent invention. It's basically a couple of economists came up with it, popularized the idea in the 1970s, and then lawyers ended up adopting it. It's not something that's, actually built into our legal system by statute or anything like that. So, just as these things can be invented, new things can be invented too. So I absolutely agree with that. And then, to your point, David, on sort of like capture in Congress, yeah, I absolutely think that that's a huge problem. Kirsten Sinema was called the senator from private equity. And I know at least one acquaintance of mine who would have been an absolutely fabulous senior government official got blocked, not by a Republican, but by Sinema. Because he was seen as too opposed to private equity. So I think capture at the federal level is extremely concerning. I think, which again kind of gives me more hope at the local level. One of the nice things about people opposing companies is there's more people than companies, and sort of mass opposition can kind of, it's kind of easier to bribe Congress than it is to bribe 50 legislatures. And so there's sort of a strength in numbers aspect to a lot of this organizing that I think is going to be really helpful at the state and local level. So all of which is to say, I keep saying it, but like to the extent you all get interested in sort of pushing model legislation or anything like that, more than happy. Life is very busy right now, but like to try to help you guys with drafting it and all that sort of stuff. I guess you did also ask about what I'm up to. I'm see you later, Andy. I'm finishing up a book on another thing called forced arbitration, which is when you sign, create a bank account or a telephone account or put your parent in a nursing home, you sign away all of your rights to sue them if you get scammed or, your parent dies or whatever it happens to be. We have created this secret justice system where the judges are paid for by the companies that you sue. And that's led to all sorts of crazy bad situations. So I'm trying to make that a story that's accessible and hopefully equally infuriating for folks.
It certainly is. I've been subject to both ends of that. Yes. Well, thank you so much for coming today. It's fascinating, and we'll do our best to help popularize this information to get more people aware of it and see if we can help get legislation passed here in California or elsewhere. And just very grateful for you giving of your time today and your generosity to help us in the future. So thank you so
Hey, no,
much.
thank you all for your interest. It really
Yeah.
means a lot. So, anyways, thank you all. We'll be in touch, okay?
Thank you, Brendan.
Thank
Take care,
you.
everybody.